Ukraine has expressed its willingness to support an American proposal for a temporary ceasefire with Russia. This marks a significant step after extensive discussions in Saudi Arabia. These talks culminated in an agreement by the United States to resume military aid and intelligence sharing with Kyiv, both of which had been suspended following a tense meeting between US President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House back in February, which led to a full-blown diplomatic meltdown. The negotiations were held in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, under much calmer circumstances and a much calmer environment. It was a bid to reinvigorate the effort to establish a 30-day ceasefire, which had been stalled because of previous disagreements. The Trump administration had halted both military assistance and intelligence sharing after the confrontation at the White House on the 28th of February. But these latest developments out of Saudi Arabia, which were announced jointly by both countries, America and Ukraine, coincided with reports of Ukrainian drones targeting Moscow in what Moscow described as the largest attack on the Russian capital since this conflict began 3 years ago. The joint statement issued by Ukraine and the United States acknowledged that any ceasefire, and in this case it would be an initial 30-day period of cessation of hostilities, would ultimately have to require the approval of Russia. However, Moscow, which did not take part in these talks in Jeddah, refrained from commenting on the 30-day ceasefire proposal. Ukraine has indicated it is ready to implement a provisional 30-day ceasefire if Russia were to reciprocate the same. The United States, in turn, has pledged to convey that Russian cooperation is essential to achieving peace between Moscow and Kyiv. Leading the U.S. delegation were Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, while the Ukrainian team included Andriy Yermak, who is a senior advisor to the Ukrainian president, as well as the foreign minister and the defense minister of Ukraine. Although Ukraine had initially said that there has to be explicit security guarantees for any ceasefire agreement to work, the joint statement that was issued in Saudi Arabia did not confirm any such security guarantee. In fact, that was the reason why the blow-up happened at the White House between Trump and Vance on the one side and Zelensky on the other. Michael Waltz, the U.S. National Security Advisor, did note that security guarantees were discussed between the officials of Ukraine and America, but it was not explicitly mentioned in the joint statement. Secretary of State Marco Rubio emphasized that the next phase involves persuading Russia to end the hostilities, even if it is for this 30-day period. This is what Mr. Rubio said after the talks.
Hopefully we'll take this offering out of the Russians. And we hope that they'll say yes to peace. The ball's now in their court. But again, the president's objective here is, number one, above everything else, he wants the war to end. And I think today Ukraine has taken a concrete step in that regard. We hope the Russians will reciprocate.
He also underscored that the responsibility to make this ceasefire work now lies with Russia. Despite the ongoing US-Ukraine discussions, there is no indication from Russia that it would accept a month-long truce, and that too without any conditions whatsoever. Russian President Vladimir Putin has signaled that he would demand concessions from Ukraine, like, for example, Ukraine completely renouncing any aspiration to join NATO as a full-fledged or even a part-time member. The war, which began with Russia's invasion in 2022, has caused 1 million casualties on both sides. Following Ukraine's acceptance of this proposed 30-day ceasefire agreement, pending, of course, Russian approval, the diplomatic focus now shifts to Moscow. Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, is scheduled to visit Moscow this week, reportedly as early as Thursday. Also, Donald Trump, speaking to reporters at the White House, said he plans on a telephone call between himself and President Putin of Russia to try and test how much Russia is willing to engage. So here are the arguments for Russia accepting the ceasefire. It would be massive economic relief. It would put a huge pause on the Western sanctions that have been crippling the Russian economy over the last 3 years. Putin could also frame this as a PR victory. He could go out there and claim that he is the peacemaker and not Ukraine and not Zelensky. And of course, in the interim, he's also made some territorial gains in the Kursk region of Russia, which Ukraine had managed to covet and managed to acquire through a covert operation that happened last summer. Also, crucially, this will give some breathing space to Putin to allow the replenishment of exhausted troops. In fact, more than 1 million casualties have been cited on either side. This could be the much-needed breather that Russian troops need. And also, This could give potential leverage in his future discussions with Trump, potential concessions from NATO, for example, which can explicitly say that they will not include Ukraine even in future talks. That is a concession that he can potentially draw out from Trump as and when the Trump-Putin meeting happens. The arguments against Putin accepting the ceasefire are that this would mean that there is a momentum loss for Russia. Russia recently gained about 12-odd settlements in the Kursk region just in the past week, since the announcement by the United States that it was pausing intelligence sharing and military equipment sharing with Ukraine. Russia has managed to reverse some of the losses that it suffered in the Kursk region. There will also be a hardline backlash. In some sections of the Russian military, the pro-war factions may view a ceasefire as betrayal by Putin. Also, the previous ceasefires, and there is a massive trust deficit between both the warring parties, previous ceasefires, whether they were in 2014 or in 2015, collapsed because ultimately Russia violated the ceasefire. Historically, Putin has also tied any ceasefire agreement to several non-negotiable demands. That includes the recognition of some of the annexed territories like Crimea, the permanent neutrality of the state of Ukraine, effectively banning it from joining NATO. Additionally, Putin has also insisted on the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from areas that are controlled by Russia, like the Kursk region. If Putin were to accept the ceasefire, then it could lead to a temporary freeze in the front lines by mid-March. There would be a 10-mile radius, a 10-mile separation between troops of both sides. There could even be international peacekeepers in that 10-mile radius. This would likely be followed by renewed US and UK arms flows to Ukraine, as both countries would try and bolster Ukraine's defenses during that ceasefire period. The focus would also shift to territorial bargaining with Russia, possibly with Russia pushing for recognition of the 20% of Ukraine that it now controls since this war began, and Ukraine could, on the other hand, push for some kind of a security guarantee that will ensure that Russia will not further push with territorial ambitions into Ukraine. However, if Putin were to reject the ceasefire, then Ukraine might escalate its drone and missile strikes against mainline and mainstream Russian targets, including in the capital, Moscow. Additionally, the US and Ukraine could also agree to expedite an economic development deal involving Ukraine's natural mineral resources. This initiative was put on hold after the Oval Office bust up, and it aims to bolster Ukraine's economy and its long-term security guarantees. The deal is reportedly worth $500 billion in what is a trade-off that involves Ukraine pledging away a bulk of its rare earth mineral deposits to America. The suspension of intelligence sharing had in fact hindered Ukrainian forces significantly in Kursk, where Russian troops have now regained some of the lost territory. On Tuesday, Russia reportedly captured or recaptured about a dozen settlements in Kursk. In response, in his nightly address, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had revealed that Kyiv in fact proposed a partial truce covering aerial bombardments and naval combat zones, but the American delegation advocated for a much broader ceasefire for a 30-day period. Zelensky also highlighted the importance of resumed American military aid, but he said that this was not explicitly linked to the ceasefire. In the middle of all of this, there is the X factor, which is Trump's negotiating style, which could play a significant role in these talks. He might in fact offer Putin a direct summit if Putin keeps his end of the bargain, which is to keep the ceasefire holding for a 30-day period. And that could potentially lead to the first ever face-to-face meeting between Putin and Trump in this second term. Additionally, Trump could also offer sanctions relief in exchange for Russian cooperation, which might appeal to Putin because it could give him an economic breather. The conflict continues along extensive trenches spanning eastern Ukraine. It's currently focused on this 700-mile border between Ukraine and Russia. There is advanced weaponry that's making movement at the front lines almost perilous on a daily basis. The joint statement by America and Ukraine offered no specifics on how to implement this ceasefire, but previous agreements signed between Russia and Ukraine, including in 2014 when Russia intervened in Crimea, that has faced significant challenges in execution. The question is, who will hold this ceasefire if either party were to violate it? Will it be the United Nations? Will it be America with some security guarantees? Or will it be some kind of an international peacekeeping force, as has been suggested by the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the French President Emmanuel Macron? And later this week, Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, has also said that he will be holding an emergency meeting of European leaders this weekend in London to try and take stock of this 30-day ceasefire if Putin agrees to keep his end of the bargain.